The small hand closed around Maria Chandler's fingers without warning. No hesitation, no asking permission, just the warm, desperate press of a 6-year-old girl's palm against hers, and the world stopped turning on its axis entirely. Maria stood in the doorway of the Reed homestead, her heart cracking open in a way she had not allowed it to crack open in 3 years. She had ridden into Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882 as a woman who had carefully sealed every tender part of herself behind iron doors. She had come as a housekeeper. She had come as hired help. She had not come to be destroyed by a child who looked up at her with those enormous dark eyes, trembling, searching, needing. Little Eliza Reed, age 6, had not reached for anyone's hand since her mother died. Ralph Reed had told Maria that plainly, almost clinically, on the day she arrived. His jaw had been tight as a closed fist when he said it. His eyes had been flat and careful, the way a man's eyes go flat when he has cried himself empty and decided to never do it again. "She does not warm to people," he had said. "She has not since her mother passed. Do not take it personal if she refuses you entirely." Maria had taken the job anyway. She had needed it too badly to walk away from any employment, and she had told herself she could keep her distance. She was good at distance. Distance had kept her breathing for 3 years, but now Eliza's small hand was locked around her fingers, and the child was shaking, and the reason for that shaking was standing 40 feet away in the yard with a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. Dale Cutter. Maria had heard the name before she ever set foot in Dusty Creek. She had heard it whispered in the saloon where the stagecoach stopped, in the dry goods store where she bought her last provisions, in the low, urgent voice of the station master who had looked at her destination and said, "Ma'am, you know who owns most of that land out past the creek." She had said she did not. He had said the name like a warning. Dale Cutter, rancher, creditor. A man who believed that owning a man's debt was the same as owning the man. And apparently, he believed that owning Ralph Reed's debt gave him the right to stand in Ralph's yard with a rifle, demanding a signature on papers that would transfer the deed of the Reed homestead into Cutter's name before the first frost. "You have got until sundown," Cutter called out, his voice as smooth as river rock and twice as hard. "After that, I am done being patient." Ralph stood between Cutter and his house, between Cutter and his daughter. His hands were open and empty at his sides, which Maria understood after only 10 days in his home was its own kind of courage, the kind that costs more than drawing a weapon. And Eliza, who had come to stand at the open door to watch, had reached back and found Maria's hand. Maria's fingers closed around those small ones without thought, without choice. She pulled the little girl gently behind her body, and she stood there in the doorway. And she understood with absolute clarity that everything was about to change. Everything already had. She just did not yet know how far the change would go, or how much it was going to ask of her, or that by the time the first snow fell on Dusty Creek, she would be so thoroughly, irreversibly in love with Ralph Reed that the iron doors around her heart would not just be cracked open. They would be gone entirely. But she was getting ahead of herself. She needed to go back to the beginning. She needed to start with the advertisement. Maria Chandler had been 28 years old and surviving in San Antonio in the autumn of 1882. Surviving was the precise word, because thriving had become a concept too remote to reach. She had arrived in San Antonio 2 years prior from Kansas City, following a man who had promised her a future and delivered her a lesson in the difference between a man's words and his character. She did not like to speak about that time. And she did not to anyone, not for a long time. What she would say, if pressed, was that she had left Kansas City with her dignity and her small leather traveling case, and she had arrived in San Antonio with approximately the same, and she had set about making something from nothing in a city that was not unkind but was not soft either. She had worked as a seamstress for 8 months. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant for 6 months after that. She had worked as a reader and correspondent for an elderly widow named Mrs. Hargrove for 3 months, reading newspapers aloud and writing letters to Mrs. Hargrove's scattered family members who never seemed to write back. When Mrs. Hargrove died quietly in her sleep in September of 1882, Maria was left without employment and with $19 to her name. The advertisement had appeared in the San Antonio Express on a Thursday. Wanted, capable and industrious woman for position of housekeeper at Reed Cattle Ranch outside Dusty Creek, Crockett County. Cooking, cleaning, and light mending required. Responsibility for one child, age 6. Private room provided. Salary $8 per month. Respond to Ralph Reed, Dusty Creek Post Office. Maria had read it 4 times. She had asked herself honestly whether she was capable and industrious. She had decided she was both. She had written a letter to Ralph Reed that was factual and straightforward, listing her experience without embellishment, acknowledging that she had no formal references but could speak to her own character plainly. She mentioned that she was comfortable with children. She did not say why. She did not explain that she had once had a daughter of her own, and that her daughter's name had been Clara, and that Clara had lived for exactly 11 days in the spring of 1880 before a fever took her. That grief was hers alone. She was not giving it to strangers. Ralph Reed had written back within 2 weeks. His letter was brief, almost curt. He wrote that he needed someone reliable and not given to drama, that the work was honest and the pay was as stated, and that the nearest town was 14 miles out. He wrote, "My daughter is quiet. She is not difficult, but she is quiet. If a quiet child troubles you, this is not the right position." Maria had read that sentence 3 times. A quiet child. She had thought of Clara, who had been too small and too new to be anything yet. She had thought of the 11 days she had spent learning her daughter's face, memorizing every detail as though she somehow knew she would not get more time. She had thought of how silence after a child is no longer present is a completely different quality of silence from any other kind. She had written back, "A quiet child does not trouble me." The stagecoach to Dusty Creek took 2 days from San Antonio, with a stop in Sonora. The landscape shifted from the relative familiarity of the city's edges into something rawer and more honest as they moved west, the scrub cedar giving way to open range, where the sky seemed to expand to fill the entire visible world. Maria sat with her traveling case on her lap and watched the land and thought about what it meant to start again in a new place, whether starting again was something a person could do indefinitely or whether there was a limit. She hoped there was no limit. Dusty Creek was smaller than she had imagined from the name, which was already not a grand promise. There was a main street of beaten earth with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a small church, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office, and a scattering of other establishments that suggested a town still deciding whether it intended to become something. The people on the street looked at the stagecoach with the practiced lack of curiosity, people who had seen enough strangers to have opinions about them. Ralph Reed was waiting at the post office. She recognized him by the quality of his waiting, which was patient and still in a way that spoke of a man accustomed to standing in open country. He was tall, lean through the shoulders in a way that suggested he worked rather than merely managed workers, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and the kind of sun-darkened complexion that comes from years of outdoor work. His hat was good quality but old. His boots were clean. His hands, when he took her traveling case with a brief, courteous nod, were strong and work roughened. He was 32 years old. She would learn this later. In that first moment she simply thought, "This man has been carrying something heavy for a long time." "Mrs. Chandler," he said. "Miss Chandler," she corrected. "My letter said Miss Chandler." "It did," he said. "I apologize." His eyes met hers briefly and then moved away, not rudely, but with the controlled focus of a man who had trained himself not to linger. "The wagon is here." They rode out of town in a silence that was not precisely comfortable, but was not combative either. It was the silence of 2 people who had agreed, without speaking about it, to wait before deciding what they were to each other. The land opened around them, the afternoon light going golden and long-shadowed across the mesquite, and Maria watched it and said nothing. After several miles, Ralph said, without preamble, "My wife's name was Caroline. She died 14 months ago. Fever. It was fast, which people tell me is a mercy, and I have decided they are correct about that even when it does not feel correct." Maria said, "My daughter's name was Clara. She died 2 years ago. Also fever, also fast." He looked at her then, a full, steady look that lasted several seconds, and she met it. Neither of them said anything else about it, but something had passed between them in those 2 sentences, some recognition of a shared territory of loss that neither of them had asked to occupy. She felt something shift slightly in her chest, like a door that had been jammed now swinging just a fraction on its hinges. She closed it again. She was here to work. She was not here to open doors. The Reed homestead was modest but well-maintained. A 2-story frame house, whitewashed and solid, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front face. A barn, 2 outbuildings, a chicken coop, a kitchen garden gone a little ragged at the season's end. The land around it was working cattle range, and in the far distance she could see the shapes of the herd. Everything spoke of a man who cared for what was his and was currently managing it alone, which was a different thing from managing it with help. Eliza was sitting on the porch steps when they arrived. She stood when the wagon came into the yard, and she stood very still, watching, with those enormous dark eyes that were so clearly her father's eyes in the face of a child that Maria's breath caught slightly. She was small for 6, thin in the way that children sometimes become thin when they are not eating properly from grief. Her dark hair was in 2 braids that were neat but slightly uneven, which told Maria that Ralph had done them himself and was still learning. Maria stepped down from the wagon and stood in the yard and said, "Hello, I am Maria. You must be Eliza." Eliza looked at her for a long moment and said nothing. Ralph said quietly, "Eliza, this is Miss Chandler." Eliza turned and went inside. The screen door closed behind her without a slam, which was worse somehow than if she had slammed it. Ralph said, "I told you she was quiet." "You did," Maria agreed. "It is all right." And it had been all right. That was the remarkable thing about the first 10 days, or perhaps the thing that was not remarkable at all but simply real. It had been all right. Not warm, not easy, but all right. Maria settled into the rhythms of the house with the practicality that had always been her defining quality. She cooked. She cleaned. She baked bread that rose better at this altitude than she expected. She mended the small pile of linens and garments that had accumulated beyond Ralph's skill with a needle. She organized the kitchen, which was not chaotic exactly, but had the particular disorder of a man who had invented his own system from necessity. She asked Ralph before changing anything, because she understood this was his house and his system, and she was a guest in it, and he always said yes but always also seemed mildly surprised that she had asked. Eliza watched from a distance, always watching. She was in a room when you came into it, quiet in a corner with a book or a small collection of smooth river stones she seemed to find beautiful. She answered direct questions in 1 or 2 words. She ate what Maria cooked without complaint and without comment. She followed the routines of the house like a small ghost, present but not quite landed. Maria did not push. She had lived long enough with her own losses to understand that grief has its own timetable and does not negotiate. She did, however, begin to leave small things. A cup of warm milk with a spoonful of sugar on the table near wherever Eliza was sitting in the evenings. A ribbon she had found at the bottom of her traveling case, blue and slightly faded, left on the porch step in the morning. A book of illustrated fables that she had carried with her from San Antonio, placed open to a page with a particularly fine drawing of a fox, positioned where Eliza would pass it. She noticed when Eliza tied the ribbon around the end of one of her braids. She noticed when the book migrated from where she had left it to a shelf in Eliza's room. She said nothing about either of these things. She and Ralph, meanwhile, found a working rhythm together. He was in the fields or on the range from before dawn until evening, returning for supper with the particular exhaustion of a man doing the work of two. He ate what she made and always said it was good and always seemed to mean it. They talked across the supper table, not deeply at first, practically. About the ranch, about supplies needed, about Eliza's lessons, which had been irregular since the local schoolteacher had moved away in July. Maria offered to take on the schooling herself, and Ralph's expression had been something complicated to read, relief and gratitude, and something else she did not yet have a name for. She noticed that he had a way of listening that was rare. Most people, in Maria's experience, were planning their response while you were still speaking. Ralph simply listened. His eyes on yours, quiet, absorbing, and then when you finished he would take a moment before responding, as though what you had said deserved proper consideration. She found this quality almost disorienting at first, because she had not experienced it from a man in long enough that she had stopped expecting it. She also noticed his hands. This was not the kind of noticing she wanted to be doing, and she was quite firm with herself about it, but they were there and they were difficult to ignore. Large, careful hands, the kind that could rope a steer or fit a window frame or, she imagined, though she shut that thought down firmly, hold something fragile with extraordinary gentleness. She was a housekeeper. She was here to work. She was absolutely not going to develop feelings for Ralph Reed. This resolution lasted until the 8th day, when she came downstairs at 5 in the morning to start the stove, and found him already at the kitchen table, not working, just sitting, with a cup of cold coffee in front of him, and an expression on his face that he had not had time to arrange into the composed mask he usually wore. He was simply sitting in the dark kitchen, being a man who missed his wife and was exhausted, and did not know how to ask for anything because asking for things felt too close to admitting that he was not managing. She did not say anything about what she saw. She lit the lamp. She put fresh coffee on. She set a plate of cornbread from last night, sliced and warmed on the stovetop in front of him. She sat down across the table with her own coffee and said, "What is on your mind?" He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Dale Cutter has been buying up land around the county for 2 years. He holds the note on the loan I took out to rebuild the barn after the fire in '79. It was my father's loan originally. When my father died and the ranch came to me, the loan came with it. I have been making payments, but Cutter acquired the debt from the original creditor last spring, and he is not interested in payments. He wants the land." Maria said, "Can he legally demand the deed if you are making your payments?" Ralph said, "A man like Cutter makes his own legal arrangements in Crockett County. The sheriff is not precisely his friend, but the county judge is a man who plays cards with Cutter every Saturday." Maria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much is the outstanding debt?" $480. Maria thought about her $19 in her traveling case. She thought about the way money worked in the world, which was that it accumulated toward those who already had it and was almost impossible to manufacture from nothing. She said, "What are your options?" And he had looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight at 5 in the morning and told her the truth. "I am not sure I have any." That was the moment. She would understand it later, looking back. That was the exact moment the iron door swung open another inch. She spent that day and the next thinking. She was not a woman who believed in being helpless when she could instead be useful. She had a good mind for figures and for the architecture of problems. She began to understand, through careful questions over the following days, the full shape of what Ralph was facing. Cutter had not simply bought the debt. He had also been engineering a series of smaller pressures, discouraging the buyers who came to purchase cattle from the Reed Ranch, making quiet complaints to the county road authority that the access road through Reed land was a public nuisance, sending men to ride near the property line in ways that were threatening without being technically actionable. He was squeezing. He intended to make the ranch untenable, to exhaust Ralph's resources and options, until Ralph signed the deed over simply to end the siege. And then on the 10th morning, Cutter himself had come. He had ridden up with two men behind him, men who wore guns with the particular looseness of people who expected to use them, and he had stood in the yard in the bright October morning and called out for Ralph with the tone of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. Ralph had come out and stood in the yard, open-handed. Eliza had drifted to the door, drawn by the voices, and Maria had come to stand behind her, and Cutter had said his piece about the deed and the sundown deadline, and the little girl had trembled, and her small hand had found Maria's. Maria stood in the doorway and felt the weight of that trust like a physical thing. She looked at Cutter, who was broad and well-dressed in the way of men who have confused wealth with righteousness, with a silver hatband and clean boots, and the particular confidence of a bully who has never been stopped. She looked at his two men, who were watching Ralph with the calculating attention of people assessing whether this was going to be difficult. She looked at Ralph's back, the set of his shoulders, the controlled stillness of a man holding himself together by the force of will alone. She tightened her fingers around Eliza's and she said, clearly enough to carry, "Mr. Cutter." Everyone looked at her. Cutter's eyes moved over her with the assessment of a man who sees women in categories of usefulness or obstacle. He said, "And who are you?" "Maria Chandler. I am employed here, and I would like to know the specific legal instrument that gives you authority to demand a deed transfer on a loan that is current in its payments." A silence opened up in the yard. Ralph turned to look at her. His expression was somewhere between alarm and something she would later identify as the first stirring of profound respect. Cutter said, "That is not your business, woman." "I am making it my business," Maria said. "Because I am a witness to this conversation and I am capable of writing a letter to the San Antonio Express regarding how debt is enforced in Crockett County. Newspapers have opinions about that sort of thing. So do lawyers in cities where the judges do not play cards with the creditor." Another silence. Longer. Cutter's jaw tightened. He said, "Sundown, read," and turned his horse and rode out, his men following. The yard was quiet. Eliza had not let go of her hand. Ralph turned fully and looked at Maria, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he said, very quietly, "That was either very brave or very foolish." "Probably some of both," she admitted. He looked down at his daughter's hand in hers. His expression did something complicated and private. He swallowed once hard. He said, "Eliza, are you all right?" Eliza looked up at Maria first, then at her father. She said, "Yes." Then she said, which was more words at once than Maria had heard from her. She sounded like she meant it. Ralph said quietly, "She did mean it." That evening, after supper, after Eliza was in bed, Ralph and Maria sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours. Not about the ranch logistics, not about the practical shape of things. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped performing and started being honest. He told her about Caroline, how they had met, how she had been brave and funny and had made this house into a home by the particular quality of her presence in it, and how after she died, the house had felt like a stage set rather than a real place. He said, "I have been moving through it like an actor who has forgotten his lines." Maria said, "I know that feeling." He asked her about her life before San Antonio, and she told him the shape of it. She did not tell him everything. She told him about Kansas City and the man she did not name, and she told him about arriving in San Antonio with $19 and her traveling case, and she told him about Mrs. Hargrove and the letters to the family that never wrote back. He listened the way he always listened, fully and without interruption. Then she told him about Clara. She had not planned to. It simply came, the way true things sometimes come when you have been in the presence of genuine attention long enough. She said her daughter's name, and she said the 11 days, and she said the fever, and she said, "I have not spoken of this to anyone in 2 years. I am not sure why I am telling you now." He said, "Because it is real and you have been carrying it alone, and it is heavy." She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the lamp flame and said, "Yes." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers for 3 seconds. That was all. 3 seconds, and then he withdrew his hand and she looked back at him, and he was just looking at her steadily, not with pity, which she could not have borne but with recognition. She excused herself shortly after and went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and felt the iron doors trembling on their hinges. The next morning she rose at her usual hour and started the stove, and told herself firmly that the previous evening had been a natural conversation between two people who had both experienced loss, and it was not romantic in nature, and she was not going to make it into something it was not. Ralph came down at his usual time and said good morning and ate his breakfast and went out to the range, and everything was exactly as it had been. Except that it was not quite, because she was aware of him now in a different way, the way you become aware of a piece of furniture that has always been in the room but that you have suddenly noticed is beautiful. She told herself to stop this. She was not particularly successful. The following week, she drafted a letter. She had been thinking carefully about the Cutter situation, turning the problem like a stone in her hands, examining it from different angles. She wrote to a lawyer in San Antonio named Mr. Avery Holt, whom she had met briefly when she worked for the dry goods merchant and who had struck her as both intelligent and genuinely principled, which was not the most common combination in legal practice. She outlined the situation with factual precision. She described the nature of the debt, the transfer of the note to Cutter, the threats, the demand for the deed. She asked what legal remedies might exist for a man in Ralph's position. She had not told Ralph she was doing this. She had used her own money for the postage, which was 50 cents she could not particularly spare. She told herself she was simply gathering information and would present it when she had something useful to present. She also began teaching Eliza. They started every morning after breakfast at the kitchen table. Maria had written to the San Antonio Public Library requesting a list of appropriate texts for a 6-year-old, and while she waited for a response she worked from what was available, which included the King James Bible, a history of Texas, a primer that had been Caroline's as a child, and a collection of poetry by Alfred Lord Tennyson that Maria had in her traveling case because she found poetry useful for the soul. Eliza was, she discovered quickly, extraordinarily bright. She was reading at a level well beyond her age. She had been reading by herself quietly while no one was looking, and she had accumulated a private store of knowledge that she released only in small measured portions, as though she was not sure how much she was allowed to have. On the third morning of their lessons, Eliza looked up from the primer and said, "My mother taught me to read." Maria said carefully, "She must have been a wonderful teacher." Eliza considered this. She said she did the voices, a pause, for the characters. She did different voices. Maria said, "What kind of voice did she use for the wolf and the 3 bears?" Eliza blinked. "It is not the 3 bears. The wolf is in the 3 pigs." "I know," Maria said. "I wanted to see if you would catch me." And Eliza for the first time smiled. Not a large smile, a small, private, considering smile, but it was real, and Maria felt it like warm light on her face. She mentioned this to Ralph at supper, not making a large thing of it. Just said that Eliza had smiled during their lesson and she thought the child was exceptional. Ralph's face did the complicated thing again. He said, "She has not been doing much of that, smiling." "She is doing it in her own time," Maria said. "She will get there." He looked at her across the table and he said, "Thank you, just that, but the weight of it." The reply from Avery Holt arrived in Dusty Creek Post Office 2 weeks after she sent her letter. Maria collected it on the supply run to town, which she had started doing once a week with the wagon, navigating the 14 miles with the calm confidence of a woman who had been managing practical difficulties for a long time. She read the letter on the wagon seat on the way back, holding the reins with one hand and the pages with the other. Holt's letter was detailed and direct. He wrote that based on what she had described, Cutter likely had legal standing to demand accelerated payment if the loan document contained an acceleration clause, which was common in debt instruments of the period. However, he noted, there were significant questions about the validity of the debt transfer, particularly if the original creditor had not properly notified the debtor of the transfer before selling the note. He also noted that a campaign of intimidation and interference with business operations could potentially constitute actionable harassment. He offered to review the original loan document if Maria could obtain a copy, and he offered to correspond further. He charged no fee for this letter. He wrote at the bottom, "I remember you, Miss Chandler. You were always more thorough than the situation required. In this case, that quality may serve you well." Maria sat with that letter on her lap for the last mile of the road home, and she thought about what it was costing her to involve herself this deeply in a situation that was technically not her responsibility, that she had been hired to cook and clean and mind a child, and was now acting as something between a strategist and an advocate. She thought about why she was doing it. She tried to be honest with herself about that question. The honest answer was Eliza's hand in hers. The honest answer was also Ralph's face at 5 in the morning in the dark kitchen, stripped of its careful composure, simply a man who was tired and frightened and did not know how to ask for help. The honest answer was that she had walked into this house telling herself she would keep her distance, and she had already failed completely, and the only question now was what she was going to do about that. She pulled into the yard and unhitched the horse and stored the supplies and washed her hands and then went to find Ralph, who was in the barn repairing a piece of harness leather. She sat down on a hay bale and said, "I wrote to a lawyer in San Antonio 2 weeks ago. His name is Avery Holt. I told him about Cutter. He wrote back today." Ralph put down the harness. He turned to face her. He was very still. She said, "I should have told you I was writing before I did it. It was your business and I acted without your permission and I apologize for that." He said, "Tell me what the lawyer said," she told him. All of it, the acceleration clause question, the debt transfer validity question, the harassment issue. Holt's offer to review the original document. When she finished, Ralph was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where is the original loan document? I was hoping you might know." He crossed to the back of the barn, to a locked wooden box that was stored on a high shelf behind a collection of tools, and he took out a key on his watch chain, and he opened the box, and after a moment of searching he produced a folded set of papers, worn at the creases, clearly old. They took it inside and spread it on the kitchen table and read it together. Maria moved through the legal language with the focused concentration of someone who had spent months reading contracts for the dry goods merchant and knew what to look for. She found the acceleration clause. She also found, on the second page, a provision she suspected Cutter was hoping Ralph had not read, a clause that specified any transfer of the debt required written notification to the debtor no fewer than 30 days prior to the transfer taking effect. Maria straightened up. She said, "Did anyone give you written notice of 30 days before Cutter told you he owned this debt?" Ralph said, "No. He just appeared one afternoon last spring and told me he had bought the note." Maria said, "Then the transfer may not have been properly executed under the terms of this document." Ralph looked at her, a long, searching look. He said, "Maria." She looked back at him. And there it was between them, clear as a bell ringing in still air, not said, not acted on, but present, undeniably present, the way a fire is present in a room even when you are facing away from the hearth. He said, "I need to get this document to your lawyer." "I can write to him tomorrow," she said. He said, "I will pay the legal fees." She said, "He has not charged any yet." Ralph said, "He will. I will pay them." And then quietly, "I will not have you spending your own money on my difficulties." "I spent 50 cents on postage," Maria said. "I know," he said, "and I intend to repay it." She almost laughed. She controlled it. She said, "It was 50 cents. "It was yours," he said simply. She went to bed that night with her heart beating at a rhythm that was not entirely healthy, and she lay in the dark and had a very firm conversation with herself about professional distance and the realistic expectations of a woman in her position, and the absolute necessity of not becoming attached to a situation that was temporary in nature, because her position here was a position, not a life, and she needed to remember that. She remembered it clearly for approximately the next 6 days. The 7th day was a Sunday, and it was the Sunday that Eliza asked Maria to do her hair. This was significant because Ralph had been doing Eliza's hair every morning, the slightly uneven braids that Maria had noticed on arrival, and which Ralph managed with the careful concentration of a man performing surgery, because Caroline had done Eliza's hair and neither Ralph nor Eliza was ready to acknowledge that it needed to be someone else doing it now. It had been one of those tender territories they simply did not cross. But Eliza came to Maria on Sunday morning with her brush and her ribbons and said quietly, "Would you do my hair, please?" Maria sat down in the chair by the window and had Eliza stand in front of her, and she worked the brush through the dark hair with gentle steadiness, and she braided it properly, and she tied the blue ribbon, the one she had left on the porch step weeks ago, at the end of one braid. She heard the floorboard at the top of the stairs. She knew Ralph was there, watching. She did not look up. Eliza said, while Maria was finishing the second braid, "Do you think about staying here?" Maria said carefully, "I am here now." Eliza said, "I mean permanently." Maria's hands did not stop moving. She said, "That is your father's decision, Eliza. I work here." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father smiles more when you are in the room." Maria did not respond to that. She tied off the second braid. She said, "There, all done." Eliza turned and looked at herself in the small mirror on the dresser. She said, "Thank you." Then she said with the devastating directness of children, "My mother used to say that home is not a place, it is a feeling. I think you might be a feeling." Maria Chandler, who had survived Kansas City and San Antonio, and the loss of a daughter and $19 and a very long stagecoach ride, sat in the chair by the window and felt the iron doors blow completely off their hinges. She spent some time thereafter being quietly, thoroughly undone. Downstairs, Ralph was making coffee and pretending he had not been standing at the top of the stairs. He was not particularly convincing in this pretense to himself. He poured 2 cups, and when Maria came downstairs, he handed her one without comment, and she took it without comment, and they stood at the kitchen window looking out at the October morning. He said, eventually, "She said something that made you cry." Maria said, "I am not crying." "You were," he said, not accusatory, just accurate. She turned her head and looked at him sideways. He was looking out the window. His jaw was set in that particular way it got when he was working on containing something large. She said something quite beautiful. He said, "She does that sometimes. She did not used to with strangers, but you are not a stranger to her anymore." A pause. "You are not a stranger to me either." The space in the kitchen was very quiet. The coffee was warm in her hands. Maria said carefully, "Ralph," he said, "I know," still looking out the window. "I know the shape of what this is, and I know the 100 reasons it is complicated, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I needed to say it plainly just once, that you are not a stranger to me." Maria said, "You have known me for 3 weeks, he said. "Some people you know in 3 weeks. Some people you do not know in 30 years. It is not about the time." She thought about the man in Kansas City, the one she had known for 2 years before understanding that she had never known him at all. She thought about how correct Ralph was. It was not about the time. She said, "I am not going to do anything foolish." He said, "Neither am I." A silence. He said, "But I am also not going to pretend I do not see what I see." She said, very quietly, "What do you see?" He turned from the window then and looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table the night she told him about Clara, with that full, absorbing, genuine attention. He said, "A woman who writes letters to lawyers on behalf of strangers, who leaves ribbons on porch steps for a child she does not have to care about, who stood in a doorway and called out a man with a rifle like it was nothing, who sits at a kitchen table at night and talks like she has been waiting to talk to someone her whole life." He stopped. He said, "That is what I see." Maria set down her coffee cup very carefully on the counter. She said, "That is a considerable amount to see in 3 weeks. I told you it is not about the time." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "When the legal situation is resolved, When Eliza is settled, when I am not in your employ, those are not conditions, they are simply the shape of things. I need to be honest about the shape of things. He said, that is fair. She picked up her coffee cup again. She said, now, we should write that letter to Mr. Holt. He almost smiled. She saw it happen and then be controlled. He said, all right. They wrote the letter together, with the original loan document enclosed, Ralph dictating and Maria writing in her clear, even hand. They were very professional about it. They were very proper. They sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table and spoke only of legal matters, and it was the most aware Maria had been of another person's presence in the same room since she could remember. The weeks that followed were a careful dance. Not cold, not distant, but bounded. Maria understood herself well enough to know that the feelings she had were real and not going away, and Ralph understood himself well enough to know the same thing, and they were both, by nature, people who respected the importance of doing things right. So they did the things of daily life with an awareness of each other that was electric and quiet and alive with unspoken things, and they waited for the shape of things to become clearer. Avery Holt wrote back within 10 days of receiving the document. His letter was longer than the first, and more confident in its conclusions. The notification provision, he wrote, was indeed a significant legal vulnerability for Cutter's claim. Furthermore, Holt had done some additional inquiry and discovered that the original creditor who had sold the note to Cutter was himself in a precarious legal position due to an unrelated fraud case in Austin, and was likely to be cooperative with inquiries that cast doubt on the validity of transactions he had made during a certain period. Holt offered to travel to Dusty Creek to assess the situation fully, and to represent Ralph's interests in any negotiation or legal proceeding with Cutter. He would bill at standard rate, but noted that cases of this nature, involving the proper administration of debt, were the kind of thing he found professionally engaging. Ralph read the letter 3 times. He folded it carefully and he sat with it in his hands for a long moment. Then he said, Maria. She looked up from the dish she was drying. He said, you may have saved this ranch. She said, Mr. Holt is saving it and you are saving it by holding on. He said, you brought us Mr. Holt. She said, someone had to write the letter. He looked at her for a moment and then he said with a sudden, unexpected softness that she had not yet seen from him, why? She said, because Eliza sat on that porch step and watched you try to manage the impossible alone, and no child should have to watch that without someone trying to help. He was very quiet. Then he said, and it had nothing to do with me, a beat. She said, I did not say that. The November air came early to Dusty Creek that year, cold and sharp before the calendar had properly turned to the month. Holt arrived by stagecoach in the second week of November, a thin, serious man in his 40s with small spectacles and the quiet energy of someone who is very good at his work and knows it. He spent 2 days reviewing documents and talking to Ralph, and on the 3rd day he requested a meeting with Dale Cutter. Maria was not present at that meeting, which took place in the county judge's office in Dusty Creek. Ralph went and Holt went, and they were gone from 8 in the morning until past midday. Maria stayed home with Eliza and tried not to pace, with limited success. She taught the morning lesson. She made bread. She reorganized the pantry, which did not need reorganizing. She sat on the porch and listened to the wind in the mesquite. Eliza came and sat beside her on the porch steps and said, he is going to be all right, you know. Maria said, I know. Eliza said, because you helped. Maria looked at the little girl. She said, your father is a capable man, Eliza. He was going to find a way. Eliza said, but you made it faster. A pause. My mother used to say that the people you let in are the ones who change things. Maria breathed slowly. She said, your mother sounds like she was very wise. Eliza said, she was. And then with the clear-eyed acceptance that is the particular province of children who have been through grief and come out the other side into something new. I think you are wise too, just different. You are quiet wise. She was loud wise. She considered this. I am glad there are 2 kinds. Maria put her arm around the little girl's thin shoulders, and Eliza did not pull away. They sat together on the porch steps in the November wind and waited. When Ralph and Holt rode back into the yard in the early afternoon, Ralph's face was different. She could see it from the porch. He looked lighter. Not happy exactly, not immediately, but like a man who has put down something he has been carrying for a long time and is now working out what his hands are without that weight. He came up the porch steps and he said, "Cutter has agreed to terms." Maria said, "Tell me." He said that Holt had presented the notification clause violation to Cutter's own attorney, who had apparently not been fully briefed on the details of the debt transfer by his client, and who had reacted with the particular displeasure of a lawyer surprised in a meeting. Cutter, facing the possibility that the debt transfer itself was invalid, had agreed to an extended repayment schedule under the original loan terms. He would continue to hold the note, but he was bound to its original terms and could not demand the deed as long as payments were maintained. Additionally, Holt had made certain quiet representations about the pattern of harassment and interference with business, suggesting that future incidents would be meticulously documented. Cutter would not become a good neighbor, he would never be that, but he had been contained. Ralph said, "Holt says he will stay one more day and write up the new agreement formally, and then it is done." Maria said, "That is wonderful." Eliza said from inside the screen door, "Does this mean we are keeping the ranch?" Ralph turned to the door. He said, "Yes, Eliza, we are keeping the ranch." Eliza said, "Good, because Maria's bread is better than the hotel bread in town and I am not moving anywhere." Ralph looked at Maria. She looked at him, and they both simultaneously laughed. Actually laughed, the real kind, and it was the first time Maria had heard his laugh fully, without restraint, and it was warm and low and it went through her like music. Holt finished his work and departed on the third day, leaving behind a signed and witnessed agreement and a bill that Ralph paid from the small reserve fund he had been too afraid to touch for months. He extended Holt's hand and said he was grateful, and Holt said that he hoped things improved from here, and he caught Maria's eye before he climbed into the wagon and said, "Well done, Miss Chandler," which was more than she had expected and which she carried quietly. The days after Holt's departure had a different quality. The threat was not gone entirely. Cutter still owned the note and always would, and there would always be vigilance required. But the acute siege was over. The ranch was still Reed land. Eliza would not be displaced, and something in the house settled, the way a structure settles when the high wind stops. Ralph began to spend a little time in the evenings on the porch rather than going directly to bed after supper from exhaustion. He invited Maria to join him, which she did, because she was a person who had decided to stop telling herself not to want things. They would sit in the two chairs on the covered porch, watching the Texas stars arrange themselves in extravagant patterns overhead, and they would talk. The easy talk of people who have stopped performing. He told her stories about his father, who had built this homestead with his own hands 30 years ago, and had been a man of exacting standards and unexpected tenderness. She told him about growing up in a town in Ohio that she had always felt slightly too large for, and her mother's garden, and the smell of Ohio mornings in spring that she still missed. He asked about her plans, not in a challenging way, not with the undertone of a man who needed her to have particular answers, but with genuine curiosity about the direction of her life. She said, honestly, "I stopped making plans for a while. After Clara, I was living from one position to the next, just keeping myself afloat. I am not sure I have started planning again." He said, "What would a plan look like if you allowed yourself one?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Something permanent, something that is mine. I have been a guest in other people's situations for long enough." He said, "That seems right." She said, "What about you? What is the plan for the ranch long term?" He said, "Eliza inherits it. That has always been the plan. I am just the steward until she is old enough to decide what she wants to do with it." A pause. "I would like to add some acres to the east. There is good grazing land that has not been worked. I would like, eventually, to build Eliza a proper school room." She deserves better than a kitchen table, even if the kitchen table has been serving us well." Maria smiled at that. He said, carefully watching the stars, "I would like the house to be full, not crowded, but full, the way it was when Caroline was alive." Another pause, longer this time. "I do not want to replace her. That is not possible, and I am not foolish enough to think it is. But I do not want to keep living in absence when I have something present right here." Maria said, "Ralph." He turned to look at her. She said, "You are doing the thing again." He said, "What thing?" She said, "Saying the thing you mean while technically not saying it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, then I will say it. Maria, I would like to ask you to consider whether your situation here might become something different from what we agreed at the start. I am not rushing you. I understand the shape of things, I remember what we said. But I am asking you to consider it, because I am, constantly." Maria looked at him in the November dark on the porch, this tall, steady man who had been carrying loss alone, and who listened when she spoke, and had put his hand over hers for 3 seconds at a kitchen table as though it was the most natural thing in the world, and then behaved with perfect respect thereafter, and she thought, "You have been surviving for 3 years, and he is right here being real." She said, "I do not need much time to consider it. I have been considering it since you handed me coffee without being asked on a Sunday morning." He said, "That was 3 weeks ago." She said, "I told you I was not going to be foolish." He said, "This would not be foolish." She said, "I know." A silence that was full and warm. He reached over slowly without haste and took her hand from the arm of her chair and held it. Not the brief 3-second contact of the kitchen table. Just held it, her hand in his, looking out at the Texas stars. She did not pull away. She laced her fingers through his and held on. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them in, and then they said good night at the foot of the stairs with a care and a formality that was not coldness, but the proper honoring of something that deserved to be done right. The winter arrived and deepened, and with it, the daily life of the Reed homestead took on a different texture. Maria's role shifted, not in any formal declaration but in the natural way of things settling into truth. She was still the cook and the housekeeper and Eliza's teacher, and she was also more than all of those things, and everyone in the house knew it and no one needed to announce it. Ralph began to include her in decisions about the ranch, asking her opinion on the cattle figures, and the schedule and the plans for spring, not because she was a rancher but because he valued her thinking. She found this more affecting than she would have predicted. Eliza blossomed through December in the way that children bloom when they feel safe. She began to talk more, her voice losing the careful minimum words quality and expanding into the full articulate rush of a genuinely clever child who had been storing words. She told Maria about the books she had read, about a series of increasingly elaborate stories she had been making up privately about a girl explorer who traveled the world by hot air balloon, about her opinions on various philosophical subjects that a 6-year-old had no business having opinions about but did anyway. She drew maps of imaginary countries. She had Maria read Tennyson aloud at bedtime and would sometimes finish a line before Maria reached it. On Christmas Eve, Ralph brought a cedar tree in from the range and set it in the parlor. Caroline had done the Christmas decorations every year, and the boxes of ornaments were in the attic, and this was another tender territory they had been navigating around. Maria went to the attic and found the boxes, and she brought them down and set them on the parlor table and said, "I would like to hear about them, if you want to tell me." Ralph and Eliza came and they went through the ornaments together, and each one had a story, a handmade paper star that had been Eliza's first art project, a small glass ball that had been Caroline's mother's, a tin angel that had hung on every tree Ralph could remember from childhood. Maria listened to all of it and held each piece with appropriate care and helped hang them on the cedar branches, and by the time the tree was finished it was not a shrine to absence. It was a living thing that contained the past and was continuing. Eliza looked at the finished tree and said, "Mama would have liked you, I think." Maria said, carefully, "I think I would have liked her." Eliza nodded, satisfied with this answer, and went to find a book. Ralph stood beside Maria looking at the lit tree, the candles casting warm shadows across the parlor. He said very quietly, "Thank you for that." She said, "She did it herself." He said, "You made it possible." He had given her a gift that morning, a pair of good leather gloves, warm-lined and practical, because she had mentioned her hands getting cold on the supply runs to town. She had given him a new volume of American history she had special ordered from San Antonio, because he had mentioned once that he was interested in the period and had never had the books. Eliza had given Maria a drawing of the two of them, herself and Maria, sitting on the porch steps in the style of a child who is very earnest and not yet technically skilled, which made it more beautiful than any technically skilled drawing would have been. Maria had kept it on the small table in her room and looked at it every morning. In January, Ralph had a formal conversation with Maria. He asked her if she would be willing to walk out with him, in the social sense of the phrase, which in 1882 in a small Texas town meant a declared courtship with intentions that were serious. He was careful and deliberate about it. He said, "I want to be proper about this. I do not want to be the kind of man who lets things be ambiguous when they do not need to be." Maria said, "I appreciate that. Yes, I would be willing to walk out with you." He said, "I will speak to Reverend Aldridge." There was a small Methodist church in Dusty Creek with a minister who was also the de facto moral authority of the county's social arrangements. She said, "That seems appropriate." He said, with the slight formality of a man who is being careful with his dignity, "I intend this to be a permanent arrangement, Maria. I am not asking you to walk out with me with any casual intention. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him and said, "Ralph, I know." He exhaled something that was almost a sound of relief. He said, "Good," she said. "You could also, simply be in love with me instead of being formal about it." He blinked. Then he said, "I am both," she said. "I know that too." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her, which was the first time, brief and certain and entirely like him, and she kissed him back, and it was the most natural thing in the world and also the most significant thing in the world, which are not contradictory positions. They walked out through January and February. Sunday afternoons, a walk to the creek and back. Church on Sundays, which meant being seen in town together, and allowing the town to form its opinions. The town had opinions. The dry goods proprietor's wife, Mrs. Callahan, made a point of saying she thought it was nice to see the Reed place looking after itself. The blacksmith nodded with more approval than the situation strictly required. The Reverend Aldridge said he was glad to see Ralph in church with some regularity, and that Miss Chandler was a welcome addition to the congregation. Dale Cutter saw them in town one Saturday on the main street and did not speak. His expression was the expression of a man recalibrating his assessments. Maria met his eyes briefly and looked away first, because there was no need to escalate anything when things were going well, but she did not look away quickly. He rode on. Ralph's hand was at the small of her back, not gripping, just present, and she was aware of it the whole length of the main street. In March, Ralph asked Maria to marry him. He did not do it in the house. He had thought about it, apparently, and decided that the kitchen table was too much of a working space, and the parlor had too many ghosts, good ones but present, and that a thing this important should be somewhere new. So he took her out on horseback on a Sunday afternoon, which she now rode with some competence, having had 3 months of practice, to a rise east of the ranch that overlooked the open range with the late winter grasses bending in the long wind, and the sky so blue it seemed like a kind of excess. He stopped his horse beside hers and he said, looking at the view for a moment and then turning to her, "I would like you to be my wife. I would like you to be Eliza's mother. I would like this ranch to be yours as much as mine. I would like to spend however many years we have left doing what we have been doing in this house, which is something I did not expect to want again and now cannot imagine being without." He stopped. He said, "Maria, will you?" She said yes. He had a ring. It had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that was the color of the Texas sky on clear days, and he had been carrying it in his waistcoat pocket since January. He put it on her finger there on the rise in the March wind, and she looked at it and looked at him and felt the extraordinary clarity of a moment that is both unexpected and completely inevitable. He said, "I know you came here as hired help." She said, "I came here as hired help, and I found something else entirely." He said, "What did you find?" She said, "Home." They were married in Dusty Creek Methodist Church on a Saturday in April 1883, with Reverend Aldridge presiding and the town of Dusty Creek in attendance in numbers that suggested everyone had wanted an occasion and had been waiting for one. Eliza stood between them during the ceremony in a dress that Maria had made from blue cotton lawn with small white buttons, her dark hair in two proper braids with blue ribbons. She held her father's hand on his right side and Maria's hand on her left, and she was perfectly still through the whole ceremony, with the dignity of a child who understands that this moment is important. When Reverend Aldridge said they were husband and wife and Ralph kissed his bride with the kind of restraint that is its own declaration of depth, Eliza said, quietly but audibly in the silent church, "Finally." The small ripple of laughter that went through the congregation was entirely appropriate. The reception was in the churchyard, the town contributing food in the manner of communities that take their celebrations seriously. Mrs. Callahan brought a magnificent layer cake. The blacksmith brought a cask of apple cider. The Reverend Aldridge said a second, shorter blessing over the food and looked genuinely pleased with the whole arrangement. Maria moved through the afternoon in her best dress, which was a deep green cotton she had ordered from San Antonio and spent 2 weeks making to fit exactly right, feeling something she had not felt in a long time, which was the sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Ralph stayed close all afternoon, not possessively, just present, his hand finding hers or resting at the small of her back or touching her elbow when she turned. The small continuous language of a man who is newly aware that this person is his, and he is hers, and he finds this extraordinary. Avery Holt sent a letter from San Antonio, congratulating them both and noting that he was glad the ranch situation had resolved in their favor and that he wished them every happiness. Maria wrote back thanking him and said they were happily settled and that Eliza was the best student she had ever had the privilege of teaching. The spring and summer of 1883 were the months of Maria learning what it meant to be fully home. She had been in the house since October, but now it was hers in a different way. The way a thing becomes yours not when you are given it, but when you commit to it. She planted the kitchen garden properly, expanding it from its ragged autumn state into something productive and ordered and beautiful, with tomatoes and peppers and beans and a border of zinnias that she planted because life needs color, and not everything needs to be practical. She painted the front porch boards where the weather had taken the paint. She had the idea, and Ralph executed it with willing competence, of adding a window seat to the parlor under the east-facing window, which made a perfect reading spot for Eliza and became the little girl's favorite place in the house. Ralph's days were long in the summer, the ranch demanding its full share of his energy, but his evenings were present in a way they had not been before. He came in from the range and washed and sat down to supper and was there at the table in the evenings on the porch in the life of the house. The exhaustion was still there. Ranch work is not gentle, but the additional weight of isolation had lifted, and the difference was visible in him. He laughed more. That was the thing Maria noticed most clearly. The contained, almost controlled quality of his early laughter had opened into something freer. He laughed at Eliza's increasingly elaborate hot air balloon explorer stories. He laughed at the rooster's ongoing unreasonable aggression toward the water bucket. He laughed at himself, which had clearly been difficult before and was now accessible. She found this profoundly moving in a way she did not try to explain to anyone because she did not need to. In the late summer, Maria realized she was expecting a child. she told Ralph on a Thursday evening on the porch. She was not certain how to begin, so she simply said it directly, which was her nature and always had been. She said, "I am going to have a child. I believe it will be late winter or early spring." He went very still. She watched him process this with the careful attention she had developed for reading the way he held himself when something was hitting him deeply. He turned to look at her. His eyes were bright, not crying, just bright, the eyes of a man receiving news that is too large to immediately contain. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am very well." He said, "Are you happy about this?" She said, "Ralph, are you asking me if I am happy about expecting my husband's child?" He said, "I am asking because you lost Clara and I want to know how you are." She breathed slowly. She said, "I am happy. I am frightened too because I know what can go wrong and I will not pretend otherwise, but I am happy, very happy." He reached over and took her hand in both of his and held it and said, "I am going to make sure you have everything you need. We will get the doctor from Sonora. We will plan properly. Everything is going to be all right." She said, "You cannot promise that." He said, "I know, but I am going to do everything that is in my power and that is a promise I can keep." She said, "That is good enough for me." Eliza was told that Saturday morning. She listened to the news with the focused attention she brought to things she was working out. Then she said, "So there will be a baby?" Ralph said, "Yes." Eliza said, "Will it share my room?" Maria said, "Not right away. We will figure that out as the time comes." Eliza thought about this. She said, "I think I would prefer a brother." She looked at her father. "Because I am already the girl in the family who is smart, and it would be nice to have a brother who needs help with things." Ralph said, "That is a very specific preference." Eliza said, "I have thought about it." Maria said, "We do not get to choose." Eliza said, "I know. I am just informing the universe of my preference." She went back to her book. A beat later she said, without looking up, "I am glad about the baby." Maria looked at Ralph. He looked at Maria. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. The autumn of 1883 was gentler than the previous autumn had been, or perhaps Maria was simply better equipped for it. The ranch had a good year. The cattle sold well, the first proper season with the extended repayment structure in place, and Ralph was able to make 2 full payments on the note and still have a working reserve. The kitchen garden produced beyond expectation. Eliza turned 7 in October and asked for a second book of poetry and a set of drawing pencils, both of which she received, and she spent the day in the window seat drawing the landscape from the east-facing window with a seriousness of purpose that made Ralph say, quietly to Maria, "She is actually good at this." Maria said, "She is exceptional at everything she decides to do. She is your daughter." He said, "She is also very much her mother's daughter." Maria said, "Yes, and that is a good thing to be." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I want her to have both. Always. I never want her to feel that loving you means being less faithful to Caroline." Maria said, "She does not feel that way. I can tell you that confidently." He said, "How can you tell?" She said, "Because she talks about Caroline to me, freely. The stories, the memories, the things she misses. She does not protect me from them. That means she knows I can hold them without being threatened by them." Ralph was quiet for a long moment. He said, "You are very wise, Maria." She said, "Eliza told me I am quiet-wise. I have adopted it as my official designation." He smiled, the full warm smile that was still capable of doing remarkable things to her sensible interior life. The winter deepened, and with it Maria's pregnancy, which proceeded with the unremarkable regularity that the doctor from Sonora confirmed was healthy and encouraging. The doctor, a compact, energetic man named Dr. Flesher, who had been practicing medicine on the frontier for 20 years, came out to the Reed Ranch twice through the winter and was satisfied each time. He told Maria she was constitutionally strong, which she already knew, and told Ralph that everything indicated a healthy delivery in the early spring, which Ralph received with the controlled relief of a man who did not intend to borrow trouble, but was also very aware of what could go wrong. Maria herself was, on balance, calm. She was more acutely aware of her body than she had ever been, and there were nights when the fear came, the memory of those 11 days and the weight of absence after, when she would lie awake in the dark and breathe through the fear with the deliberate practice of someone who has decided not to let it govern her. Ralph, who was a light sleeper and noticed when she was awake, would sometimes simply put his arm around her without speaking, and she would put her hand over his, and they would wait out the dark hours together. She said to him once at 3 in the morning, "I need to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "If something goes wrong, if the baby is not all right, I need you to know that I will survive it. I survived Clara. I know what that survival costs, but I know I can do it. I'm not saying this to frighten you, I am saying it because I do not want you to be afraid on my behalf. I'm afraid sometimes, but I am not fragile." He said into the dark, "I know you are not fragile." She said, "Good." He said, "I need to tell you something too." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I am afraid too. Not just for the baby, for you, if something happened to you." He was quiet for a moment. "Maria, you have made everything real again. You have made this house into something living. Eliza is herself again because of you. I am myself again because of you. The fear is not about losing what we are building, it is about losing you." She turned toward him in the dark. She said, "You are not going to lose me." He said, "I know, I am just telling you the fear." She said, "I am glad you told me." He said, "We are good at telling each other things." She said, "We are." She paused. "It is one of my favorite things about us." He said, "What are the other favorite things?" She said, "Go to sleep, Ralph." He laughed quietly, and she smiled in the dark, and eventually they slept. The baby arrived in March 1884, on a windy Tuesday morning that rattled the shutters and drove cold air under the doors. Dr. Flesher had been summoned the day before when the contractions began, and he had arrived late that evening, and settled in with the professional calm of a man who had attended more births than he could count. Ralph stayed in the house, downstairs, as was the custom of the time, and he paced the parlor floor with a steady rhythm that eventually became unconscious. Eliza sat in the window seat with a book open on her lap and watched her father pace. After some time she said, "You are making me dizzy." He said, "I am sorry." She said, "Sit down." He sat down. She said, "She is going to be fine." He said, "You do not know that." She said, "I know she is strong and she is not alone this time." He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, in the window seat with a book on her lap and those enormous dark eyes that saw everything. He said, "You are right." She said, "I usually am." She went back to her book. Then after a moment, "Papa, if it is a girl, I would like her middle name to include something related to the stars. Because Maria reads me Tennyson and there is a lot of stars in Tennyson." He said, "We will discuss names when we know who has arrived." She said, "I am putting in my request early." The baby was a boy. He arrived with a full set of opinions about the experience, announced through vocal insistence that could be heard clearly downstairs, and Ralph stopped pacing abruptly when he heard the first sound, standing in the middle of the parlor with both hands pressed against his mouth, looking at the ceiling. Eliza said, "A baby." Ralph said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Our baby." Dr. Flesher came down 20 minutes later and said that Maria was fine, was in excellent condition, was asking for Ralph, and that the baby was healthy and substantial and very clear about his feelings on the matter of being born. Ralph went upstairs. Maria was propped against the pillows in the lamplight, the baby in her arms, and she was tired in a way that went to the bone, and she was more completely radiant than Ralph had ever seen her. And he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and his wife, and he put his face briefly against Maria's hair, and she felt him breathe once deeply. She said, "He is very loud." He said, "He gets that honestly." He looked at the baby, who was now quiet, the red-faced, urgent, furious arrival having given way to the focused, squinting contemplation of the newly arrived. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your nose." He said, "That is unfortunate for him." She said, "I happen to like your nose." He kissed her forehead and held her hand and looked at their son and did not say anything else for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. They named him James Thomas Reed. James for Maria's father in Ohio, who had been a steady man she missed. Thomas for Ralph's grandfather, who had been the one to first come to Texas. Eliza, informed of the name, said it was acceptable and that she still maintained the star's objection for any future siblings. James Thomas Reed was, from the beginning, a force of nature. He was loud and vigorous and hungry and determined in the absolute way of certain children who arrive with their full character already assembled. He slept in short, violent bursts and was awake for stretches that tested all available adult endurance. He had, even in his first weeks, an expression of profound assessment that made Maria say he was clearly going to be a magistrate. Eliza was fascinated by him. She approached baby James with the careful intensity she brought to interesting problems, studying him from a safe distance at first and then gradually moving closer until she was regularly sitting beside Maria while she nursed him, watching the baby with an expression of scientific interest. She asked questions. Why did he look like that? Why did he cry differently for different things? Could she hold him? She learned to hold him with a care so deliberate it was almost formal, her thin arms perfectly positioned, her face grave with responsibility. Ralph watched Eliza holding her brother one afternoon and said to Maria quietly, "She is going to be extraordinary." Maria said, "She already is." Spring moved through April and May, and the ranch green with new grass and the cattle fat on it, and the kitchen garden going in again with Maria's particular thoroughness, though Ralph now helped in the evenings, having developed actual opinions about the placement of the tomatoes. Life at the Reed homestead was not simple. Nothing about ranching in West Texas in 1884 was simple, and Cutter still rode the county and still owned the note on the loan, and would for years yet to come. There were difficult months for money and difficult seasons for weather, and the ordinary grinding difficulty of life on the frontier. None of this had been edited out or resolved away. It was simply real, but it was also genuinely, substantively good. 2 years after James was born, in the spring of 1886, Maria was expecting again. This time the pregnancy was more confident, the fear still present but less dominant, partly because she had evidence from James that her body was capable of the full journey. She told Ralph with a smile rather than a careful speech, and he picked her up, which he had never done before and which surprised them both, and then set her down and apologized for being excessive, and she said she did not mind excessive and kissed him until he stopped apologizing. Eliza, now 9, said, "I am renewing my star's name request." She had apparently been holding this position in reserve. This baby was a girl. She arrived in October of 1886, during a golden autumn afternoon that Maria would always remember as the exact color of warmth. She was smaller than James had been, quieter, with a watchful quality from the very first hours that made Maria say she would be a poet. They named her Clara Rose Reed. Maria had thought about this name for a long time and had talked to Ralph about it carefully, explaining who Clara had been and what it meant to use the name again, whether it was a tribute or a burden. Ralph had listened in his full way and then said, "You know best. If it feels like honoring her, then it is honoring her. If it feels like you are trying to recover what cannot be recovered, then perhaps another name. What does it feel like?" Maria had said. "It feels like carrying her forward, like she was here for 11 days and loved and lost, and she deserves to have her name in the living world with the people she never got to be among." Ralph had said, "Clara it is." And for the middle name, Rose. For a bush in the yard that Caroline had planted before she died, and that still bloomed every May with small tough red roses that refused to be discouraged by the West Texas sun. Eliza had suggested it because she was 9 and had opinions, and they were always worth listening to. Clara Rose Reed was, from her first days, exactly what Maria had predicted. She watched everything with enormous eyes. She was not loud. She was intense and silent, and absorbed the world through observation before she would consent to participate in it, which made her very much like her father in temperament, and Maria suspected, very much like a certain child who had once watched from corners with smooth river stones and blue ribbons. Eliza adored her with a particular fierceness, as though she recognized something. She learned quickly how to make Clara laugh, which involved certain faces and a ridiculous voice Eliza had invented for the purpose, and this was highly classified information not shared with the adults. James, who was 2 by then and in the full command of toddler sovereignty, was initially uncertain about Clara, but came around definitively when he discovered she would watch him with genuine fascination while he performed his most experimental physical activities. Having an audience was enormously satisfying to James, who was already the kind of person who preferred an audience. The years moved through as years do, not slowly and not quite fast enough. The ranch grew steadily, Ralph adding the eastern acreage he had mentioned to Maria in those early months. He built the schoolroom for Eliza, a proper room off the back of the house with good windows and shelves for the growing library of books, and then Eliza used it to teach James, and then Clara joined them, and the small room became the Reed family schoolhouse with Maria still presiding. Though by the time James was 7, she had also brought in a formally trained teacher from Sonora for 2 days a week. A young woman named Miss Petrova, whose methodical approach balanced Maria's more intuitive style with excellent results. Eliza grew into exactly what she had promised to be at 6 years old, sitting in corners with her river stones and her enormous eyes. She was tall and serious and brilliant, with a talent for drawing that had developed from the earnest sketches in the window seat into something genuinely skilled. By the time she was 12, she was producing maps and illustrations of the West Texas landscape that made people stop and look. Ralph sent several of her drawings to a printer in San Antonio who confirmed they were remarkable. Eliza took this information and put it away quietly, as she did with all useful information, and continued drawing. She was also still quiet fierce in her protection of the people she loved. Cutter's son, a boy of about 15 who attended church in Dusty Creek, made an unwise remark one Sunday about James being a baby, and Eliza said something to him in a voice too low for adults to hear that made the boy turn red and move away. Maria did not ask what she had said. She trusted the general approach. James grew into a loud, energetic, deeply affectionate boy who would climb onto his father's lap and demand stories with the authority of someone who does not anticipate refusal. He had Ralph's dark coloring and Maria's directness, and his own particular quality of warmth, an immediate generous warmth that made people comfortable around him without his trying. He was going to be a rancher. He announced this at age 5 and maintained the position consistently. Ralph taught him to ride before he was 6 and to rope before he was 7, and to read the cattle with the slow patience that is the real skill before he was 9. Clara grew into her watchful intensity and confirmed Maria's prediction. She wrote quietly in notebooks she kept in a particular box under her bed, poetry and stories and what she called observations, which were small careful recordings of things she noticed that other people did not. At age 8, she showed one of her poems to Maria without saying anything about it, just leaving it on the kitchen table one morning. Maria read it and sat very still for a moment and then went to find Clara in the garden and said, "You should keep writing. This is real." Clara said, with the composed manner that was simply how she was, "I know." The note on the ranch loan was finally paid in full in 1889. Ralph made the last payment in person in the bank in the county seat and received the signed paper confirming the deed was fully clear. He came home with that paper in his coat and he found Maria in the kitchen garden with Clara, who was 3 and very interested in the beans, and he held up the paper without saying anything. Maria looked at it. She stood up from the garden bed and crossed to him and took the paper and read it and then looked at him. He said, 10 years to pay it off, but it is done. She said, "Ralph," he said, "I know," she said, "Dale Cutter never got a single acre." He said, "Not a single one." She kissed him there in the yard in the afternoon sun, next to the kitchen garden that she had planted the first spring, and had expanded every year after, with Clara watching them from among the bean plants with the measuring attention of a child who is always going to be a writer. That evening Ralph sat on the porch alone for a while before coming in, and Maria let him have that time, because she understood that he needed to sit with it, the weight of what had been carried and was now done, the 10 years of managing a threat that had defined the shape of things since before she arrived. She knew he was talking to Caroline somewhere in there, the way people do when someone who was part of the struggle is not present for the resolution, and she found this not painful but right. When he came in, he sat down at the kitchen table where she was finishing the dishes, and he said, "Thank you," she said. "For what specifically?" he said. "For the letter to Holt, for standing in that doorway and calling out a man with a rifle, for staying, for all of it." She dried her hands on the dish towel and came to the table and sat across from him. She said, "I did not stay because you needed me, Ralph. Not entirely. I stayed because I wanted to be here, because this is where I want to be." He said, "I know, but the two things are not mutually exclusive." She said, "No, they are not." He said, "I loved you from very early." She said, "I know that too." He said, "I was afraid to say it for a long time." She said, "You said everything except the words. The words were just the last part." He said, "The words matter." She said, "They do. I love you. They do matter." He smiled at her across the kitchen table, in the lamplight, in their kitchen in their house in the country they had made. And she smiled back, and it was the same thing it had always been. A fire in a room even when you were facing away from the hearth, a door swinging open on its hinges, a hand reaching across a table and finding another hand. Eliza married at 23, a schoolteacher from Sonora named David Park, a quiet, thoughtful man who loved her drawings and listened when she spoke and could keep up with her intellectually, which was her primary requirement. Ralph walked her down the aisle of the Dusty Creek Methodist Church in 1900 with a face that was composed in the way of a man managing very large feelings, and Maria sat in the front pew next to James, who was 16 and already taller than his father, with Clara beside her. And she watched Ralph give his daughter to David Park and thought about a little girl sitting on porch steps with enormous dark eyes, watching a wagon come into the yard. Eliza had her first child, a boy named Thomas after Ralph's grandfather, in 1902. She brought him to the ranch for the first Sunday after the birth, and Ralph held his grandson with the same careful reverence with which he had once held James and Clara, and Maria watched from the kitchen doorway and thought about the way life accumulates goodness if you let it. James took over the active management of the ranch at 18, not displacing his father, but working alongside him with the particular competence of a child raised in the knowledge of how a thing is done. He was a genuine cattleman, talented and patient and sharp with the figures, and Ralph trusted him completely, which was both a practical reality and a profound emotional fact. They worked side by side through the first years of the new century, and the Reed Ranch under their joint stewardship expanded to twice what it had been when Maria arrived in 1882. James married at 22, a rancher's daughter from the county north named Elena Vasquez, a woman with dark humor and considerable practical skill, who immediately liked Maria and was liked in return, and who brought into the Reed family a larger, richer connection to the Mexican and Spanish heritage of the region that had always been present, but had not always been fully acknowledged. Elena's grandmother had stories that went back to when this land was still New Spain, and she told them at Sunday dinners in a mixture of English and Spanish that made the table better. Clara, who was studying languages by then, absorbed Spanish with the same focused intensity she applied to everything and became the family's best translator within a year. Clara did not marry young, she wrote. She sent her work to a newspaper in San Antonio at age 19, and they published one of her pieces, a description of the West Texas landscape in autumn that was so precisely observed and so genuinely felt that the editor wrote back asking for more. She published steadily through her 20s, essays and occasional poems, building a small reputation as a writer of the frontier experience. Maria kept every clipping in a leather folder that Clara had not asked about but knew existed. At 25, Clara married a journalist named Henry Webb, whom she met when he came to interview her for a San Antonio paper about what it was like to be a woman writing for publication in 1911. He was 32, a good man with an honest mind who was immediately and visibly in love with her, and she considered him carefully for 8 months before agreeing to marry him, which was very Clara. Ralph and Maria attended both weddings. They danced at both, which was not something Ralph had been known to do before Maria, but which she had introduced as a practice years ago at a town celebration, teaching him the steps in the kitchen one evening with Eliza calling out encouragement from the doorway, and he had decided it was an acceptable activity for a man of his temperament as long as his partner was Maria. They grew old together, which is the least dramatic and most profound thing two people can do. The ranch was solid and expanding in the capable hands of James and Alina and their children, the 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl born through the first decade of the new century. Eliza and David visited regularly from their home in Sonora. Clara and Henry sent letters more often than they visited, because they were always in the process of writing or going somewhere to write. But when they came, the kitchen table was full and loud, and everything Maria had ever wanted a table to be. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done and the children and grandchildren were in their own places, and the ranch was quiet under the enormous West Texas stars, Ralph and Maria sat on the porch, still in 2 chairs, still with coffee or, in the cool seasons, something warmer. Still talking, because they had never stopped talking, because in nearly 30 years they had not run out of things to say, which was the most reliable evidence Maria knew of that they had chosen each other correctly. He reached over sometimes and held her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the dark and listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds. She had arrived in Dusty Creek with a traveling case and $19, and the careful practiced distance of a woman who had stopped expecting things to be good. She had found in a house on the West Texas range a child who placed smooth river stones in corners, and a man who listened with his whole self, and a kitchen garden, and a porch, and a life that had accumulated into something so solid and warm and true that she could no longer imagine the shape of herself without it. She had found Eliza's hand reaching for hers in a doorway, trembling, trusting, choosing her. She had found the answer to whether a person can start again, whether there is a limit to the beginning of things. There is not. There is not, as long as you are willing to stand in a doorway and hold on. The stars over Dusty Creek were enormous and extravagant, and they had been there long before any of this and would be there long after. And Maria Reed sat beside her husband on their porch and watched them and was entirely, completely, permanently home.